Why isn't this headline news? Well, unfortunately, this is something of a rhetorical question, but seriously, this is so shocking. This happened in New York on Thursday night. Pro-Palestinian protesters had gathered outside Chabad Lubavitch World Headquarters in Brooklyn, where Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's national security minister, was due to speak. Ben-Gvir even has past convictions in Israel for supporting terrorism and the incitement of racism. He's openly committed to removing the surviving Palestinian population from Gaza and colonizing Gaza with illegal Israeli settlements. And he's made repeated genocidal statements, including during his visit to the United States, where he discussed with Republican leaders at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort bombing food supplies in Gaza, which he says had their support. As national security minister, he's responsible, for example, for the prison system in Israel, where Palestinian detainees, most of whom should be considered hostages, are tortured, beaten, starved, raped, and killed. There are surely few more deserving targets for protesters than Ben-Gvir. This is a war criminal, a hateful genocidal racist who in a rational, sane, and just world would be behind bars. Now later, a violent mob of pro-Israel supporters, all of them men, surrounded one of the pro-Palestinian protesters, a 29-year-old woman who was being escorted by a police officer. They were chanting, "Death to Arabs" in Hebrew, as well as misogynistic abuse, including threats of rape. They brutally assaulted her, throwing a garbage can at her legs, as well as smashing her head with a traffic cone, causing her to recoil and scream in pain. The mob screams, "Get him." Let's have a look at some of the footage.
You want someone to bend you over and fucking rape you like they're doing?
So a pro-Israel mob of violent men shouting genocidal slogans against Arabs physically assaulted a young woman while threatening worse, including rape. There was also, I should say, another incident in which pro-Israel protesters targeted a second woman and injured her as well. Here's a plot twist. The woman posted a picture of herself afterwards, blood on her face and a bandage on her head, having required medical assistance for a head wound. She's smiling defiantly, joking that the emergency medical services said she still looked hot despite her injuries. And it turns out she's Jewish and she has an Israeli passport. Let's imagine, shall we, that a Hamas leader visited New York on a speaking tour. Okay, I really am asking you to bend your imagination here. That would clearly never happen. They'd be barred from entering the country. If they managed to enter, they'd be promptly arrested. Anyway, let's just go along with this, shall we? Protesters marched against these Hamas leaders. Then a mob of largely Arab American men yelling "Death to Jews" surround a young woman they identify as one of the protesters and physically assault her, leading her to be hospitalized with a bloodied head injury. And it then transpires she's actually also an Arab American woman with a Palestinian passport who's protesting against Hamas. Look, I was then having to play this game, driven by the obscene double standards at play here. But you can imagine, it would be front page news. It would lead news bulletins. It would lead to fierce denunciations from politicians across the West, including the US president. I know it. You know it. We all know it. Now, ever since 7th of October, there's been a massive focus on the question of Jewish safety in the US and the Western world. To be clear, Jewish safety is extremely important. All Jewish people in the West deserve to be safe and secure. Anti-Semitism is real. It's a grave evil, and anti-Semitism must be confronted and defeated. The problem is twofold. Firstly, that the question of threats to Jewish safety has been deliberately conflated with opposition to Israel's genocide in an effort to silence and indeed criminalize anyone speaking out against the genocide facilitated by the United States and its Western allies. Secondly, anti-Palestinian and indeed anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism and hatred has been deliberately left out of this conversation. On the first point, we saw how protests against the genocide, particularly on university campuses, were demonized and portrayed as a dangerous menace to Jewish people, even though all of these protests involved Jewish students, including in leading positions. This absurdity was brought into sharp relief a year ago when a young woman marched into a protest at Yale University to prove it was anti-Semitic. Just take a look at what happened. incredible stuff there. She was wearing a t-shirt emblazoned with Jew, yelling, "Look at my face, I'm not afraid, I will not feel shame," and got completely ignored. And the real chef's kisses was 3 Jewish protesters were standing next to her holding a Jews for a Free Palestine banner. Really just sums up the absurdity of the whole thing. Someone trying to self-victimize themselves, acting as though somehow they'd be menaced or threatened because they're Jewish, while actual Jewish protesters against the genocide were freely standing around and participating in the protest she claimed was an existential threat to people like herself. Now, this phenomenon was articulated very well by Nara Milanich, a Jewish academic at Columbia University. I interviewed her about this a year ago. Very instructive.
I think we have to distinguish between actual, real discomfort. And we need to take that discomfort seriously, that students may feel when they encounter ideas that are anathema to the ideas or radically different from, or seemingly hostile to the ideas with which they grew up, right? We have to distinguish between discomfort, emotional discomfort, and actual harm and harassment, actionable harassment.
Now, Donald Trump, who has a history of making anti-Semitic statements, who has reportedly said that Hitler did some good things and wanted to fire his generals like Hitler did, who is openly supported by Nazis and white supremacists, who he's met, has used the question of Jewish safety to issue a diktat criminalizing pro-Palestinian protests on campuses and indeed deporting people who've taken part in campus protests against the genocide. At the same time, anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab and anti-Muslim hatred has not been taken seriously at all. The opposite, in fact. It's been whipped up by politicians and media outlets, up to and including Donald Trump himself. There's been hideous crimes, like the Illinois landlord who stabbed to death the 6-year-old Palestinian-American boy, Wadia al-Fayoum, as well as leaving his mother with severe stab wounds. There were the 3 Palestinian students who were shot in Vermont, leaving one of them paralyzed. And in February, a Jewish man in Florida shot 2 Israelis he thought were Palestinian. In an absurd twist, 2 Israeli victims who survived relatively unscathed were convinced their attackers were Arab and concluded their post about the attack with "Death to Arabs." Meanwhile, Donald Trump uses Palestinian as an insult and has repeatedly called, of course, for Gaza to be emptied of its Palestinian population, while Republican politicians have used repeatedly genocidal language, from the Republican lawmaker who called for all Palestinians to die to the Republican Congressman Randy Fine, who has called for Gaza to be destroyed, its streets to overflow with blood, so on. Really blood-curdling genocidal stuff. And of course, there's been an endless stream of genocidal statements from Israeli leaders and officials, of course, Israel armed and backed by the US and other Western countries, as they actually enact genocide against the Palestinian people. Yet, with this context, the lack of media coverage of what happened in New York has been instructive. Take this headline from Reuters. New York probes reported counter-protest assaults during Israeli officials' visit. As the academic Asal Rad, who has done an incredible job exposing absurd, racist Western headlines about Israel's genocidal onslaught, just exposing the double standards and all the rest. Anyway, as she puts it, would you have any idea that this headline is about a pro-Israel mob assaulting women and shouting "Death to Arabs" in New York City? Who thinks for a moment this would have been the headline if it had been a mob of violent Arab-American men screaming "Death to Jews" as they attacked a young woman opposed to Hamas? This once again exposes the loud and proud, unapologetic double standards at play here. They're not even trying to hide it. We will continue, however, to discuss and expose what the mainstream media overwhelmingly refuses to do. Please like and subscribe with your thoughts and your comments. Help us take on a media which is helping to facilitate a genocide in plain sight at patreon.com/OwenJones84. You make all of this possible, all our content across all the different platforms. You can listen to the podcast, so avoid looking at my face. Do share the video. I'll speak to you soon.